Good morning, guys. I can see you all starting to come in, so I hope you're all having a really good morning so far. Hi Samantha, lovely. Good morning, Sam. It's always a relief when the presenter can get in.
Hello. Sorry, I was just turning my audio on. I'm so glad this is working.
Do not worry at all. It's absolutely fine. We've still got people trickling in, so we're going to give it a couple of minutes
Yeah,
before we get
cool.
started.
I'll check out how my screen share's going
Okay.
as well. I always find that's like, it's not sharing my screen, so I just do that.
Always the technology side of it, isn't it? Oh, I can.
Yeah, so it says, when I click to share screen, it says host, host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay, give me a moment. I'm just going to mute myself and I'll try and fix that. 1 second.
If not, what I'll do is I'll quickly email across the presentation just in case, but hopefully it'll be fine.
There we go. Give it a try now.
Okay. Share screen. Okay, cool. Let me know if it's how it's going and if it's working. Is it working? Yeah, good.
It's thinking about it.
This is the problem, isn't it? I really don't mind presenting, but I just get so worried about the technology.
Same. No, the
But
technology is the pain.
cool. Okay, good.
Okay, you might just need to pop it onto big screen, Sam, because we can see the menu at the moment.
Slideshow from beginning. Is that
Lovely.
okay?
That's perfect. Lovely. All right, guys, I think generally people have joined. Sam, I'm really sorry. Do you mind muting? I can hear an echo on myself and it's really
Yeah, sure.
I don't like it when I can hear my own voice. Um, Welcome to this PBS conference today. We're so excited that we've got so many people signing up today. It's absolutely brilliant. So thank you very much for making the time in a very, very busy schedule. We do know what it's like. For those of you who couldn't make Paddy's welcome session that just happened, just a real quick reminder that although we are working really hard to keep this conference free, and we feel like it should be free for people to access and learn the best about good practice in our field, this year, for the first time, we have set up a Just Giving page for the Newman Trust. So the Newman Trust is a complete charity who runs holidays for young individuals with additional needs. It's entirely run by volunteers and survives 100% from donations. So if you feel able to add whatever you can give, 50p, a pound, whatever you've got, to that Just Giving link, that would be incredible. Thank you. We are going to pop that into the chat as well so that you can all access that link really easily. Those of you who are collecting CEUs from this session, they are available for this session. Again, at the end of the session, we will share the link with you, and I'll just chat through some of the information you need to pop in that form once you get the keywords. So listen out for those keywords throughout the presentation. I will let Samantha introduce herself, but I'm thrilled to introduce Samantha. Thank you very much, Sam. I will hand over to you.
Thank you. So I'm here to talk today about supporting young people to build resilience. Thank you for registering for the event, and obviously thanks to PBS UK for hosting the whole day today. I know I'm really looking forward to seeing other people's talks as well, so that's great. So a little bit about me, just to begin with. So this is some of my experience, just so there's a kind of wider understanding of why I'm giving this presentation. I have worked in adult social care. That was for 4 years. I've worked for Leonard Cheshire, the Priory, and the National Autistic Society. And this was in a variation of roles. So I was a support worker with the National Autistic Society, and a behaviour consultant for the Southwest with Leonard Cheshire, on a maternity role, and PBS practitioner for the Priory. So that's kind of my adult social care experience. And then leading on to really why I'm doing this presentation today, I've been working in kind of mainstream education for the past 5 years, and that is in roles such as deputy safeguarding lead, behaviour support manager, and pastoral lead. So not necessarily exclusively behavioural roles, where the title is around specifically supporting young people with their behaviour. But that's kind of what's led me to do this presentation today. I've also worked in special educational needs education for 3 years. That was as a teaching assistant whilst I was studying for my master's. And then I have supported residential settings. At the moment, I support a company in Somerset who actually looks after children. So the children in their care kind of are in care for whatever reason related to situations with their family not being safe for them to live there. So in that role, I consult with social workers, schools and other professionals to make PBS plans around these young people and make sure the staff teams are trained in how to deliver those plans. So that's something I'm doing at the moment, which I'm really enjoying. And then other things I'm doing right now is ABA home programs. I've mentioned the PBS packages for looked after children, and I also supervise RBTs and aspiring BCBAs, and I deliver training courses. Myself and my colleague at the moment are in the middle of a training course which is going to be aimed at parents, and we're just kind of formulating how that will look, but our main aim is to kind of give some accessible information on behaviour analysis for parents. Yeah, so that's me, and I've been a BCBA for 4 years. Okay, so moving on to assessments for trauma. So I am going to, a little bit later in the presentation, get into more around a definition for resilience and how we support around that. But to begin with, to provide a kind of overall overview of how kind of supporting resilience could look, I wanted to talk about some of the assessments that are available when we're looking at potentially the trauma that young people have experienced and kind of my experience and how I've used the assessments. The kind of rationale for this is that if we have specific information about the events which have happened to these young people, and we don't need to obtain that information directly from the young people, we can obtain that information from documents. But if we have that more specific information around their history, that means that when we're kind of setting up our interventions, we've got a little bit more information around the correct stimuli that we need to be looking at in the environment, which are impacting kind of like the current challenging behaviours. So that's my kind of rationale for why I feel that it's great to kind of have a look back through their history, really, and see what's happened, and then that will help in the behaviour support planning process. But the other side of this is I know that there's also models in operation around kind of giving these interventions irregardless of if we're aware of what's happened. But this is just my kind of take on, I guess, how we could assess if that's the route that we want to go down. So one assessment I've used is the Adverse Childhood Experience Questionnaire. There's 10 different sections to this, and each section kind of enlists another potentially traumatic event that could have happened to that young person. Again, I know that these questions are actually directed to the young person that kind of you're working with, but I prefer to look at paperwork and then kind of pull that data onto this, as opposed to asking these questions to young people, just around, I think, avoiding distressing that person. So this is something you may be aware of already, this scale. And it does give an overview of different events which may cause harm to a young person, essentially. And I think what's important is that although the research isn't specifically behaviour analytic, there is research which states that people with higher amounts of adverse childhood experiences, so say they've scored 4 out of 10 or 5 out of 10, those people later in life suffer from more issues with their physical health. As I said, that research isn't necessarily a behaviour analytic research, but it is important in terms of the outcomes for people that have suffered these events, and actually how these events affect physical health and life outcomes, as well as things like behaviour, which we are looking a little bit more at. And then another scale, just potentially to use, is the sorry, I've kind of blanked. It's the scale for post-traumatic stress disorder. And this scale I got from one of the sites on post-traumatic stress disorder. I believe it's the UK site. And essentially, again, this one is more actually discussing present events rather than past events. So kind of what their current experiences are that they're finding difficult. I do find some of these things useful, actually, because I feel that if we know that someone is really struggling with their sleep as a behavioural professional, then there's obviously interventions that we can put in place for that. But this is kind of an assessment where we can find that information out. Similarly, like, for example, number 4, kind of, are you suffering from feeling upset when something reminded you of this stressful experience? So this then, if that person is able to answer that, we can then go a bit more into, okay, well, what are those things that are associated to that stressful experience, which will support us in the behaviour support planning. So as I said, I find these useful, but I don't want to give any young person kind of content that's necessarily distressing. So it's not always the case that you would ask them to kind of do this with you. In some cases, though, that could be applicable. So there's other sections on the scale around irritable behaviour, feeling angry, risk-taking behaviours, and again, sleep troubles and strong negative feelings. So I think all of it's important as from a perspective of, we want to gather an overview of that person's experience generally as well. So it helps us to actually understand their experience overall. This is our first word for the CEU. So make sure you take a note of this one. I'll just leave it on here for a couple of seconds. But yeah, this is the first one that you need to note down. Okay, great. Okay, now I mentioned that I had experience working in mainstream education and with young people who are looked after children. So what I wanted to kind of talk about was what a trauma response could actually look like. I know this is kind of a difficult one because it's very, very difficult to say this without kind of having a lot of information about that person, and it could really vary between people how they're going to be presenting these trauma responses. So these examples are more from my practice, what I've kind of seen, and things that I've directly observed that I could kind of try to explain behaviourally. So the first one is hypervigilance. The young children that I've worked after who are looked after children, I have observed them in a variety of settings to support situations like educational placement breakdown for some of the young people. And during those observations, I've been able to observe the young person being kind of displaying hypervigilant behaviours. These behaviours include kind of misinterpreting social cues. So instead of kind of understanding, I guess, specific social stimuli, actually struggling with that and misinterpreting things. So one example I like to use for this is I worked with a young person when I was working in a secondary school in Somerset, which was about 2 years ago. And that young person would react quite strongly in the classroom when another young person was being, I don't want to say reprimanded, but when the teacher would pull another young person up and say, some of your behaviours are quite disruptive, this young person would respond really strongly to that. So that would be one example. And the reason that's an example is because that young person is kind of seeing things happen in their environment and they're causing them to be quite triggered. Another example is I worked with a number of children in education who really struggle sitting at the front of the classroom, and in fact, in many situations, would then escalate to display challenging behaviour if they were seated in that place. And when I came to speak to those young people about why kind of that was difficult, when they labelled to me, this is difficult, I can't do this, they would say that they felt like they've got all these other young people sat behind them, and they're not able to see what they're doing, and that makes them feel quite distressed. So I think that was a really good example of how hypervigilance can actually look in an educational setting. And I think it is just, if you are able to observe an individual and you're seeing that they are displaying kind of checking behaviour, so they need to check things repeatedly, and they are kind of quite heightened generally to things in their environment, hypervigilance might be something to consider with that type of behaviour. Safety-seeking behaviours is essentially behaviours which generate stimuli which cause that individual to feel relief. Now, these types of behaviours, the example I like to use because I feel that it really helps outline this is I heard from someone who was an adult that they felt that they needed to regularly check their bank balance throughout the day, and that when they checked it and saw that there was money in there, they would feel this relief. So the relief kind of emotional feeling was directly linked to accessing kind of their bank account and then seeing that there was money in there. And that behaviour was, the reason that behaviour was kind of safety seeking is because that individual went on to state that when they were younger, at times there'd been some difficulties accessing food due to lack of money in the household. So it's essentially behaviours which provide you with a kind of a sense of relief and a sense of perceived escape from something happening or avoidance. Another example that I'll give is someone who was burgled potentially at one point, then repeatedly feeling the need to check their doors and windows are locked before they're going to sleep, or just generally repeating the checking, because every time they check, they get that relief feeling of knowing that, yes, it is locked and I am safe. So that's a couple of examples on that one. Safety-seeking behaviours feature in obsessive compulsive disorder research too, and some of that might have sounded kind of familiar to you along the lines of OCD and how that works. Okay, So what I've written there is behaviours such as these are learned in dangerous environments. So in an environment where you have little access to food, you may learn to repeatedly check money or how much money there is, when you can access money. And then that behaviour, because of the associated belief that it gives you when you see that you have that, would then continue into an environment in which you don't necessarily need that behaviour functionally, just because you still gain the relief feeling and the escape of it's the escape of a perceived threat. So I think that's important in terms of young people and trauma. And then you also have avoidance of events or stimuli linked with specific historic events. So avoiding certain situations or people. I know I've worked with children in looked after care who have felt that and verbalized that it's really difficult for them to work with male support workers. So that would be kind of an avoidance. And then what I saw is that there would be more incident forms generated in the presence of those male support workers. So then what you are kind of considering then is speaking to the young person and considering kind of their perspective on that. So what can they verbalize to you to support you to understand this? And then also training the male staff members, because I know sometimes it's not always possible to present a completely kind of one sex whole staff team. That's quite difficult for a company. So then you might want to consider training the male support workers in some more kind of pairing techniques and relationship building techniques to just support that process whilst you're still working with the young person and trying to reduce maybe the young person's exposure to these support workers if possible. Yeah, great. Okay, so moving on to kind of the main reason we're here, really. I think it's important that I give kind of the information around the assessments and the behaviours first before we then consider resilience as an actual skill or an actual concept. Okay, so resilience is actually defined as a person's ability to overcome a difficult situation. Now, my take on that is, although we of course, we want to support young people to be able to overcome these situations and to deal with the presentation of adverse stimuli, essentially, in behavioural terms. At the same time, we do need to think about kind of that person's history and what these situations are, because in fact it's maybe very difficult for them to function in a way that you would expect following experiencing these types of events. And actually what we don't want to do, which I've seen happen, is we don't want to put the onus on the child to become more resilient. We don't want to be saying, you know, your emotional responses to that stimuli is disproportionate, and so you need to be more resilient as a person. So I want to kind of avoid that situation, because I don't buy into that, because obviously someone who's experienced a traumatic event or traumatic events, we don't want them to feel, especially young people, we don't want them to feel that as adults we're expecting them to resolve their current behaviours that are based on these things that have happened. So that's kind of not, that is what resilience is, but that's kind of not what I kind of want to look at in terms of how we're helping young people. So there is research to say that another definition is resilience is a dynamic process encompassing positive adaptation within the context of significant adversity. Again, like some of the wording to me is difficult to handle because it's saying, you know, that you're adapting when there's significant adversity, and actually some of the responses young people have to significant adversity, such as fight or flight responses, freeze responses, these aren't things that they are able to themselves help themselves with. They're kind of biological processes. So again, I don't want to focus on kind of the way that we generally define resilience. What I want to look at for resilience is how we help young people to feel more in control of the environments that they're in, that they're finding difficult to manage, and how we also help them to kind of build their autonomy and their emotional understanding and regulation skills. That's more what I feel it would actually be supportive for these young people. Okay, and then that brings us to a tricky subject again, which is how, as behaviour analysts, or I know some of you are in a range of fields and from a range of backgrounds, but generally, how can we kind of think about when we do our support planning and we are working with these young people, how we actually consider their emotions in this process, and how to support them to basically become a little bit more autonomous and to gain skills around their emotions. Okay, so there was some research done, again, this is a while ago, it's 1998, but there's some research done around emotions and emotional regulation and why it should be present in behaviour support planning. And actually, this study was more about anxiety as opposed to feelings of anger, feelings of distress. This was more about actually people suffering with anxiety. So behaviour analysts have obviously done research into the fact that our use of language and derived relations can acquire specific functions. So what I mean by that is neutral stimuli that may not, so neutral environmental factors or events that have not functioned previously as adversive to a person can begin to function as an adversive stimuli to a person, not through direct experience of that stimuli. So even if a young person has not had direct experience of a specific event or a specific negative outcome, because we have language as humans, actually we can derive relations between things, and stimuli can become adversive in the environment simply through the relations that language can cause us to make between stimuli. So I think to simplify that a little bit, essentially what I'm saying is that a young person doesn't always need to directly experience an event for stimuli surrounding that to become aversive. They can become aversive just through their understanding of what's been said to that young person. So essentially, without direct training, neutral stimuli can acquire an aversive function because it can then stimulate a certain event or signal a certain event or condition without direct training. How this relates to trauma is that, as I've kind of just said, stimuli which are not directly related to traumatic events can acquire functions via this derived relational responding. And if you're a behaviour analyst, or training, you will have awareness of this concept. But if not, the concept is essentially just that we can make relations between things because of the fact that we have language. So stimuli can become kind of conditioned. Furthermore, thoughts, which are still events and they're still behaviours, and I've described them at the bottom here as private events because they still happen to everybody all of the time, can acquire kind of functions or meanings or feelings behind them. And this was a kind of behaviour analytic research study that just for me really pinpointed the fact that although there hasn't been much research into emotion from kind of the behaviour analytic field, we can, through these concepts, understand how actually emotion is something that we should be looking at. And then, so trauma responses, as I said earlier, behaviours developed in unsafe environments, continue for periods of time following the original event or events. And I think that's really important because what we're saying here is that because those behaviours or responses develop such feelings of safety or escape or avoidance for young people, they continue into environments where actually there's not any danger. So, and we can look at these behaviour analytic concepts to help us understand why that is. And actually there's a scientific kind of basis for the fact that that happens. So essentially, so stimulus equivalence, I've talked about derived relational responding and stimulus generalization. So stimulus equivalence, identifying a relationship between two or more non-identical stimuli. We've talked about derived relational responding, but responses that have not been explicitly taught but can be learned by linking responses together. And then stimulus generalization, response that is associated with one stimulus occurs for another stimulus that is similar in some way. So it's generalized onto a very similar thing, which you may have seen happen frequently in your practice, that although a specific trigger isn't directly related to that original traumatic event, actually it's kind of similar enough, and then it's built the same function onto that. Okay, this is your second and actually last word that you need to take account of. So I'll just give you a couple of seconds just to note that one down as well. That will help you to get your CEUs at the end. Okay, now to get into kind of the main bit of the presentation after all of the context and other bits that we needed to go through just to get here. Now what I'm going to talk about is, this is not a framework. Let me just disclaim with, this is not a framework that has necessarily been researched. It's not a framework that is necessarily something that's kind of that I found from somewhere. These are things that I have kind of seen in practice and feel that actually these are really important steps to take if you're looking at building resilience or emotional regulation. So let me just kind of disclaim with, I have pulled this together. It's not something that's been explicitly researched in itself. Okay, so the first bit, and I've alluded a lot to this in the rest of the presentation actually, around talking about stimuli, environmental events. So the first bit is safe environments. So making environments feel safer for young people. So the way that we would be seeking to do this, following potentially an assessment, we can use some of the assessments that I talked about earlier, or we can ask the young person kind of questions about what they find difficult or things that they feel that they would need help with. Or I talked about earlier the seating plan thing. So there's different ways we can look into this, but we want to increase safety signals. So things in the environment that cause that young person to feel safer, and we want to decrease triggers that make them feel less safe, basically. And this research is actually from two of the people that were working with me when I did my postgraduate diploma and my master's in behaviour analysis. And I believe Jen is actually doing an event today as well, so that would be really great. But stimuli correlated with the absence of aversive events signal safety. So if a young person kind of has stimuli that makes them feel that actually that outcome is not going to happen, then that can make them feel safer in a situation, because they don't. So identifying stimuli that are signals of aversive events may allow us to monitor said stimuli in environments to work towards safer environments. So if we know what that young person finds really difficult to deal with, and it's linked to maybe an original traumatic event, or it's just something that we know that causes them to struggle or feel emotional or feel upset in an environment, then we can directly work towards removing those triggers, essentially. Now, I've worked with mainstream schools for 5 years. I have worked with an abundance of young people who really struggled at when an adult raised their voice. In the past, for them, an adult raising their voice signalled to that young person that they were going to potentially be harmed in some way, or that this would escalate into something really aversive for them. Now, as you may be aware, in kind of some educational settings in the UK, we're not overly aware of kind of PBS yet, and behaviour support planning, and the ways we should support young people with their behaviour, which is a bit more trauma informed. And so I did see that happen kind of throughout my time in mainstream education. And I did a lot of work with those teachers on kind of actually outlining to them how that makes that young person feel. That young person feels scared. It triggers a response of fear. That fear response and the way it presents is kind of an escalation in the behaviour that's happening. So some of these things are quite simple things that we know anyway are to be avoided. We know that, but it's just that in some settings actually where we're not kind of overly aware of positive behaviour support and we're not using behavioural practice, they are still doing these things. So it's just thinking of stimuli that are going to be difficult for that young person and reducing them. I worked with a really lovely young person in one of the secondary schools I was with, who eventually, after a couple of years of me kind of working with him one-to-one and working with his teachers, was able to actually say to his teachers, I really struggle when you raise your voice. Please, can you kind of consider like the way that you're talking? And actually that practice and that kind of training from that the whole school got around that extended to the head teacher and kind of wider networks. So sometimes it's useful just to think about these triggers and how we get rid of them, basically. Additionally, lots of people now talk about approach and avoid behaviours, which is a really good practice when we're thinking about trauma. So in what events do young people approach you or approach a certain situation, and in what situations do they move away? So if we can have an observer in a situation, be it a classroom or just a residential situation or a situation in the community, where we can actually see kind of just take data on the approach and avoid behaviours. This would help us see what occasions the approach behaviours. So instead of actually focusing on what I talked about already, which is the triggers to the behaviours, we're focusing on what are the triggers for approach behaviours, where actually the young person is seeking that connection and is engaging with other people in the environment more. Okay, so I'm sure everyone has kind of an understanding of relationship building and how relationships can be made stronger. The residential homes that I work with, this is something which we work on. And the reason for that is if you have changes in like your staff team, or you have new staff from different environments, it may mean that people need kind of this training on how to build relationships. So these are some of the techniques that I always suggest that I think are really good. So non-contingent reinforcement, so delivering positive reinforcement at timed intervals as an intervention or a form of relationship building. So when I supervise registered behaviour technicians, some of the work that I do at times is actually assessing how often they're presenting reinforcers to the young person, because then we can strengthen the approach behaviours that that young person displays towards that RBT. So that's one technique. To do this, we need to know what that young person's reinforcers are. And in some settings, this could actually just look like building a strong schedule of meaningful activities for a young person to engage in with support workers. So it's not necessarily just for younger children where we're thinking about presenting toys and things. With teenagers, you could also think about things like a reinforcer could be maybe you playing on their Xbox with them. So there's kind of different ways you can do this, but you need to essentially find out first what your reinforcers are. The 5-1 approach, this is something that I suggest to support workers quite frequently, in which kind of taking data on how many positive statements you say to a young person and how many are negative. Now, realistically, we are kind of avoiding negative statements anyway. So by negative, I might mean potentially corrective or that type of statement, but this generally seems to help. So it helps people be creative about what sort of positive statements they can be saying to young people. But that's a good ratio of how that could go. So another thing to think about is if a young person has experienced intermittent reinforcement, say from a parent or from another kind of trusted adult, this may fragment kind of the strength of their connection generally with adults, because there wasn't consistency in responding. So I think it's important when we're thinking about connection and interaction, I think it's important to think about kind of reinforcing regularly to build that kind of trust relationship, where in the past a young person has had difficulties with that because they're not getting a consistent approach from a caregiver or from an adult in another setting. And then there's a paper which most of this information has come from, in which in that paper they actually use responsivity training. I always struggle to say that word. Essentially, this training is increasing staff responsiveness to communication requests via training in communication profiles. So actually, the staff get increased training on specifically how that individual communicates, So I've just started to think about now. So communication passports. So if we create really good communication passports and then we train staff specifically in the person's communication style and how they communicate and what that looks like, then we can train staff to acknowledge all communication attempts made by that person, and then needs can be addressed better. So I think that's one way of building a really good connection, is just by doing that. So when we have people with learning disabilities who may have less language, that's important then the support workers can actually identify a communication attempt, because that's obviously not always the case that they can identify that. And then turn taking and reciprocity. So essentially the fact that in a conversation, the way that the conversation flows, the way that each person takes turns to speak in the conversation, and each person's inputting their different input. So these are some ways of relationship building, but I'm sure that there are many more different techniques, but these are some that I find helpful. And then my third and last step around building resilience for young people is self-management techniques. The reason I believe that self-management techniques are going to be supportive for young people who've experienced trauma is because these techniques allow young people to increase their independence and autonomy, which I think is important when we think about building self-esteem and confidence in young people. I think it's important that we do ensure autonomy. So self-management techniques have been shown to produce strong generalization of skills. So that's another really great factor, is that if you teach these techniques, then the generalization is likely to be a bit higher. And then it's a positive because self-management, we can support clients with their independence, and these techniques will require less supervision, which is a positive factor. And also we can work closely with the client to understand how their trauma responses affect their functioning with self-management techniques. So when I've looked at self-management techniques with young people before, I've asked questions. What makes you feel angry? What does that look like for you? And we know that this information is featured in Positive Behaviour Support Plans. What does that look like for you? How does that make you feel? What behaviours do you think that you display when you feel that way? So what we're doing is we're kind of supporting them to identify their different states, so their different kind of states of regulation. We can help them to identify their hypervigilance, their kind of phase where they might feel upset or a little bit down. We can help them identify these different states and when they're happening. And then through this helps us to kind of formulate the strategies for each of those situations. The strategies don't just need to be for the young people, they can also be for the adults supporting the young people. So yeah, that's kind of how I've used it before. I've actually formed grids before where I'm asking the questions that I just said around what makes you feel angry, what makes this worse, what makes this better, and then you're kind of giving them the ability to have the self-identification, which I think is quite empowering for young people who have maybe experienced adults trying to obviously support them with their behaviour and their regulation. It's quite empowering to actually be able to identify this for themselves, in my opinion. And then another one is mindfulness training. So there is lots of research into mindfulness training and how it can support people and how it's evidence-based, which is really great. And I think the reason I think mindfulness is important is because going back to what I just said about helping a young person explore their different emotional states and how they can support themselves away from these and what makes these states worse. Mindfulness can fit into that really well, because as we know, strategies to support things like hypervigilance are going to relate back to and be very closely linked to strategies to support relaxation, of which mindfulness is really great. So I think that's where that can come into it as well. And then just a little bit more on self-management. So as I just said, you are kind of supporting the young person to study the stimuli which occasion their distress states, which I feel empowers young people. You can ask the client about their internal events and the external events that are occasioning these, and what the covert emotions, so the sadness or the anger, what that young person would look like when they feel that way. And I have found that to be quite effective, and young people are able to identify where they're at in these certain stages when I've worked with teenagers in schools. And then, yeah, this isn't, so kind of what I've said today isn't to say these are exclusively how we can build resilience with young people. This is more to say that in my experience, I have found making environments safer, relationship building and building on their self-management really, really useful. So what I've done is I've just popped here my contact, and what I'll do now is I will stop screen sharing, and I know there's some questions, and Katie will help me know how to go through those. And I've just got as well, there are a couple of sites of like references there, but this is my email if there's any questions. And I've also got a Facebook page which is just Achieve Behaviour Consultancy.
That's great, Samantha. Thank you so much for that. That was brilliant. I think hoping that I might help you with the questions is a little optimistic in terms of my technical ability, but no, that was brilliant. Thank you. It's so sort of refreshing to listen to people talking about trauma and resilience and those sort of aspects in a very practical, here's some steps way, rather than a very sort of broad statement, trauma informed, because it can become a bit of a buzzword, can't it?
Yeah,
it's lovely to hear it actually, like
help,
steps to try. Yeah,
definitely.
So we have had a few questions come in, guys. If you still have questions, there will be time. We have got about 10 minutes, so please pop your questions in the Q&A. So some of the ones we've sort of been just jotting down as we go, Samantha. One was around just thinking of those sort of individuals that we might work with who have that much lower level of verbal behaviour.
Yeah.
During the sort of process, say you brought in to do a functional behaviour assessment and you're looking at some of those challenging behaviours, how would you necessarily discern between, say, trauma and other setting events? And actually, do you need to, or do you just need to take that approach anyway? And what would be your sort of opinions around that when a lot of your analysis is based around observation?
Yeah, I completely understand that. I do think that is really difficult, and I think that's why I think that it's great when we've got some sort of background information and we've looked at like the assessment criteria that I mentioned, because I do think that otherwise we're not entirely sure if these responses are related to trauma or if they're simply kind of other types of responses. But I think, yeah, I think so. Going back to kind of looking at that client's history, I think is good. And also, like you said, we can still kind of treat that in the same way, because people use the phrase kind of trauma assumed as well now, don't they? So I think that we could still kind of assume that, but my gut response is when I see young people and the behaviours are really kind of visceral, and what I mean by that is they're really kind of fight or flight based, and the kind of urgent need to get out of that situation is really strong. That's when I kind of start to be concerned. But yeah, as I said, I always try and get some sort of background if I can.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much. We've just had some more questions coming in. So we've got a question here around working with adults with trauma. So have you seen these sort of techniques used with adults, or have you heard about a sort of a similar process being used with adults who might have experienced trauma?
Yeah, so most of my experience is with young people, I will admit, but I did work in adult social care for 4 years. And I do think that similar things can happen. And I do think that, again, I guess some of these strategies are a kind of safety net in terms of the fact that if you are a little bit unsure about some of that trauma and what's happened, it is always good. There's not really a situation in which it's not good to enhance like the relationships between staff and the client, or to enhance someone's self-management skills so that they're more independent, um, or to try and remove some of those triggers. So I think that, yeah, I do think that irregardless of kind of like age and things,
Yeah.
all of the strategies would be supportive. But also, I guess, with that type of thing. So it's just looking at the approach and avoid behaviours again, so that we can kind of see what occasions are making them kind of have the connection, and then what is kind of making them avoid it, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think they're still important for adults. I think it could be used in the same way.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think it was really interesting when you were chatting, actually listening to how much sort of there was overlap with the intervention sequence outline
Yeah,
with individuals, and actually that is something that is routinely used with adults within social settings. So actually, I would agree with you. I would say it was probably very applicable to adults as well.
yeah,
Like
sure.
you say, enabling environments and building rapport is never going to be a
Yeah,
bad thing.
it's important.
Yeah. Fabulous. We've got some more questions if you've got time.
Yeah.
Have you ever linked with occupational therapists when looking into this sort of thinking about sensory needs and that side of things?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Yeah, there have been times where I have specifically. So there's been some times that I've written a behaviour support plan, and we kind of have the sections of strategies. So the proactive, and then the active, and then the reactive, and then the recovery. And there have been occasions where you can get really good support from an occupational health therapist, because they can give you the kind of overview of what that person's like physical needs are, and then how they can be supported to kind of express that and explore that when they're in these difficult states, to help them regulate again. So yeah, I think doing that is a great idea, because we can learn a lot more about their physical requirements when they're in these stages.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. That's great. This is a really interesting one, actually. Do you have any advice if the trauma or the trigger is school itself, and actually it's something that the young person has to face daily, but then that's triggering the trauma daily?
Yeah, I know what you mean. And we're seeing this more and more, which I think it's now called emotionally based school avoidance. I've just finished working in a mainstream school as a deputy safeguarding lead, and we are seeing this more and more, because I think young people went through, and this is not me kind of diagnosing it or saying that I think this is the reason, but because young people went through years of being at home, coming back into these situations is extremely difficult. And there's been kind of a national increase in emotionally based school avoidance behaviours. Yeah, so I completely understand around that. I think that if we know the traumatic event that happened within the school, if it's a specific event that happened within the school, then we'd obviously be looking into how the school can ensure that that's mitigated. And it may even be useful sometimes to involve the young person in how that's going to be mitigated, and how it won't be repeated, for their kind of, I guess, for their safety signals in a way of that environment. But also, I think some of the strategies I've discussed could help, because the main thing that I advice or kind of support people, especially in mainstream settings where there's not there's not many intricate interventions taking place that are being carried out consistently across all staff, is the relationship building element. Because I guess if you compare an adult as a positive kind of reinforcement, and they can carry out some of the relationship building techniques and build on the trust, I think, of adults. Because it may be that, I mean, I don't know the situation, so I don't know the specific stimuli that are kind of occasioning that trauma, but it could be to do with adults. So in that case, we would work towards kind of building the connection back in, and the trust. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, no, I think that's brilliant. Thank you. That's a really hard one because actually, without any specifics,
you do need to know
yeah.
And also, it depends if you even know what the original traumatic event actually was. And that makes things really tricky, I think, sometimes when you don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I think we've got time for just one more. So I'm just going to pop to this. If we haven't had a time to get to your questions, obviously Samantha did pop her email address in. So please feel free to email questions through. But if we just go for the last one then, which is, do you have any sort of advice or techniques for working on self-management techniques with young people that may not wish to engage in the discussion?
Yeah, I know what you mean. It is hard because sometimes, and this is the difficulty, I think, when you're working with young people, is they haven't necessarily always chosen to have involvement with someone. The involvement has come because it's been observed that they need that support, but it's not something that they wanted. And yes, I've been in this situation frequently with young people. My answer to that would be that before you discuss those things, you need to ensure that you've paired really well with that young person, which will look like essentially you just doing really nice, fun things with them.
Yeah.
And another thing that I advise some residential staff to engage in is emotional kind of validation and coaching. So if you can be in the situation when the young person is struggling, you can say things, you can kind of label things for them to support them with the identification of things. So, I can see that you are feeling angry. How can I support you with the way that you feel? So if they're not willing to sit down with you one-to-one and actually go through things, you can kind of do it when the situation arises. But yeah, I've definitely been in that situation before, because sometimes the school refers the young person or the home manager refers them, and the young person doesn't want to necessarily engage with you, and that is really difficult. I always try to be really transparent around kind of my role and bring some kind of authenticness to that, and say, look, like, this is my role within this setting. I do really want to help you with this thing. Like, are you finding this difficult? Is this something that you are finding difficult? And then kind of try to go in that way. I said a few bits there, so I hope that was helpful. But if not, please do email me.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you. I've just done something crazy with my Zoom and you've gone really small. I don't know what I've done. Yeah, that's great, Samantha. Thank you so much.
That's great.
That is absolutely fantastic. Guys, if you are hoping to collect the CEUs, we are just working to try and figure out what I've done to my computer. And then we will be sharing the CR code. Nope, a QR code. A CR code is not a thing. We'll be sharing it at the end of each session. So if we don't manage to share it this one, you will get it in the other ones. If you follow the link and you are wanting CEUs, it's £8 for a CEU. If in the comments you could pop your name as you'd like it on the certificate, please, the name of the talk you have attended, the 2 keywords, and most importantly, your email address so that we can send you a certificate, because otherwise we don't know where it's going. That would be marvellous. Thank you so much. But that is it. One second. I'm just handing over to tech support, who's trying to fix me, and she's done it. She's amazing. Right. I'd be lost without her. Okay. Yes, that's doing something funny. So we will share the QR code at the end of the next session. if you want it and you're not attending any other sessions today, please drop us an email at PBS UK and we will get that out to you. Apologies for that. Samantha, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for the questions.
Thank
Bye.
you. See you
Bye.
soon. Bye-bye.